Hello! If you're new here, hi, my name is Jay, yes, like the letter, and I love to overanalyze my interests and talk about menial details. If you're coming back, though, welcome back. Thank you for putting up with me. Really quick, I just want to extend a huge thank you to everybody who supported my last video. I did not expect that to get more than maybe like 20 or 30 views, and as of recording this, it is sitting at 6,000. Oh my god, thank you so much. This video isn't going to be as introspective or sociological as that one, but I hope we can still have some fun and bitch about Dutch Vanderland. Because if there's one thing I love to do, it's bitch about Dutch Vanderland. So let's get into it. It's no surprise that the protagonist of Red Dead Redemption 2, Arthur Morgan, is an incredibly skilled shooter. Not only because the game is quite literally a shooter amongst its many genres, and it would be pretty lame to have a main character who just sucks with a gun, but because he's a Wild West outlaw who's clinging to the last remnants of the open frontier as it disappears. And as we play through the game and we see how Arthur interacts with the people and world around him, we get these little hints that he feels as if his physical strength and ability to fight is his greatest asset. This idea is reinforced by the people around him who encourage and praise him for his physical attributes, his violent behaviors, and his intimidating demeanor. And while there's definitely a conversation to be had of whether or not this is what Arthur is truly proud of, it is undoubtedly a very prominent strength of his that we see throughout the story that contributes a lot to his character. Similarly, in the first Red Dead Redemption, our protagonist John Marston is a very skilled marksman. Both of them have this pretty much superhuman ability to slow time and perfect their aim, and this strength complements both the story and characterization of John Marston, an ex-outlaw who's struggling to rid himself of hhis violent past, who also just happens to be an expert marksman, and uses this strength to his advantage when he's forced by government agents to confront his ex-gangmates, the same gangmates who once ran with him and knew of his abilities. It's an interesting look at how hard it is to get rid of that past when his greatest strength is tied so closely to the very actions and lifestyle he wishes to leave behind. It doesn't take a genius or my over-detailed explanation to understand that the strengths that our protagonists have are just that, a strength. There's a physical advantage that they have over others, and they understand that well enough. And in a gang of rugged outlaws, you would expect that to be the case. But not all of the gang's notable members' greatest strengths lie in what they can do physically. For Dutch Vanderlyn, his greatest strength is his speech. Now, what do I mean by that? Throughout the events of both games, primarily the second, Dutch Vanderlyn displays his capabilities as a very deliberate and, quite frankly, very impressive speaker. As much as it pains me to compliment him, it's undeniable that Dutch's ability to talk with anybody he comes across is a pretty impressive feat. He's able to come up with excuses and conjure narratives out of thin air. He creates these stories and these lies that always perfectly explain his reasoning for everything, in a way that always absolves him, of course. I don't mean to say that I think Dutch is some top-notch, charismatic, smooth-talking genius who never messes up and can talk himself out of every situation he comes across. Absolutely not. We are repeatedly shown how that is just not the case at all. My point is that unlike our protagonists, who depend on their more physical capabilities to accomplish their goals, Dutch depends on his ability to speak. Whether he's successful or not isn't really relevant or the point I'm trying to make. Dutch Vanderlyn believes that he can talk himself out of any situation, that he can charm any person he perceives to be below him, that his words can sway everything and everyone that he wants it to. And we're shown how a lot of the people around him also seem to hold those beliefs, perhaps because they've fallen victim to it before. I also want to preface that by explaining all of this and analyzing it and dissecting it, I don't mean to imply that I think Dutch is like incapable physically. He is plenty physically capable and a skilled shooter, and this becomes much more evident as time goes on. Dutch grows much more physically violent and depends less on his words. This video is just meant to take a look at how Dutch tends to default to speaking when he gets into conflict. It's not that he can't physically fight. I just think it's interesting that a leader of a very notorious gang of thieves and outlaws presents himself as someone who can charm and speak to anyone. And that's exactly what we see many times. I guess I also want to warn you guys, sorry there's so many prefaces here, but I guess I want to warn you guys that this is also going to inherently veer into the subject of manipulation. It's hard to talk about how Dutch uses speech and deliberately chooses his words and not talk about how he manipulates people, but I'm not intending to focus on that in this video. My point is not to discuss the finer details of Dutch's manipulation and what his goals are with manipulating people. I more so just want to look at how Dutch uses speech and what he intends to invoke with his speech, whether that ends up being manipulating or not. I just think it's intriguing how much thought and effort he puts into his words. He knows it's his strongest asset, and so do the people around him. We're seeing this man decades into his criminal career. He has learned what works and what doesn't. He has learned how to consider his audience and know when certain threats will work and certain threats won't. He chooses his words very deliberately depending on who he's talking to, how well he knows them, or what the context of the conversation is. And juggling all those factors comes with some knowledge, or in Dutch's case, plenty of ego. And there are no shortage of examples when it comes to Dutch talking, but I have tried to narrow down what I feel are some of the biggest examples of what I specifically want to look at here. It was kind of hard to figure out how exactly to present this, so I think I'm just going to go chronologically and take it from there. And despite trying to narrow it down, there's still a lot to go through, so I'm going to stop prefacing and just get into it. Now, before we even delve into this example, I just want to say that I think this is the least egregious example of what I'm going to talk about here. This speech in particular is very rooted in reality. It's not very outlandish. It's certainly much more understandable than some of the other speeches Dutch has in this game. I just want to note that before I get into it. The speech that Dutch gives at the very beginning of Red Dead Redemption 2 as the opening credits play is one of the first examples we get of Dutch's confidence and capability with speaking. In this moment, Dutch is intending to stir certain emotions and paint a certain picture for his gang. I also want to point out that at this point in the story, we do not know who these characters are yet. We do not know these people or what their story is. But because of the way Dutch talks, he very quickly establishes himself as the leader. Now, obviously, the characters do not need to be told who Dutch is, but if he's speaking in such a way that even an outsider looking in can tell immediately that he's the guy in charge, then it's a subtle reinforcement to all the people who already know him. To the first-time player, this is just an establishing moment. To all the characters in the game, this is their leader reclaiming his position. And we see this in the way that Dutch expresses his concern for his people. He is very aware of their worries and their discomfort, and he goes on to reassure them that everything will be okay. And as their leader, that is his responsibility. This is not a bad speech in any way, nor does it paint him in any kind of manipulative or bad light. If anything, it showcases his humanity and his ability to understand the fear that his gangmates have, while also acknowledging his responsibility to take care of all of them. I'm not bringing up this speech to dissect how some of the things he says here can be kind of guilt-trippy. Instead, I want to call to attention the fact that Dutch makes a lot of very bold promises here, and he kind of expects everybody to just take him at his word and blindly trust him. Now, I do think he is saying these things because he actually believes them and he wants to keep his people in good spirits. Again, that is his role as the gang's leader. But considering this is our first time seeing him, and the first time we are seeing him deliver a speech, no less, we are shown how much confidence he has in his own words and the fact that he expects his people to just put blind faith and trust in him. Dutch goes on to acknowledge the people that they've lost and the difficult position that they have found themselves in. But with that, he demands their trust. It's not a question of, will you please continue to stick with me as I try my absolute hardest to get us out of this terrible situation we found ourselves in? Dutch does not roll that way. He does not ask. He needs them to stay strong, and he demands that they must stay with him. There is no choice. It's a bare minimum expectation that he feels he is owed by these people. And if you know the story or you've played these games before, then you know that we will see this expectation a lot as the story progresses. But the reason behind that is a conversation for a different time. My point here is Dutch depends on his words to speak louder than his actions. He's depending on his people to take him at his word and nothing else. Again, yes, as a leader, it is his responsibility to try to keep spirits high, but demanding their faith while simultaneously refusing to acknowledge his own mistakes that have led them to this position in the first place is very deliberate on his part. He's just making blind promises because he knows these people. He knows how they will react, and perhaps he knows that he's made them in the past and it's worked before. This understanding of his audience and choosing his words very deliberately based on that is what I want to call to attention. And on the topic of deflection and avoiding to acknowledge his faults, we see a very similar thing happen later when the gang relocates to Horseshoe Overlook, though I'd argue he's a little more selfish here. Dutch very proudly proclaims that the gang has survived, and now, he says, it's time to prosper. Hosea is quick to remind Dutch that prosperity was going to happen back in Blackwater, until Dutch and Micah got very excited about the infamous ferry job. And considering that was the catalyst that ended them in this situation and where they are right now, I think that's a fair point to bring up. Sort of a cautionary tale, if you will. He's just reminding them that they need to be careful and consider the mistakes that they've made so they don't end up repeating them. But Dutch's response still is not to admit what he has done wrong, or even to apologize. Instead, he gets defensive and says, "We've all made mistakes," as if that absolves him of the huge and devastating one that he has made. No, we haven't seen the full consequences of those mistakes yet at this point in the story, but to deflect the responsibility that he should be able to take as a leader by saying, well, we've all made mistakes, don't single me out, is kind of crazy. And Dutch continues to deflect as Hosea brings up his worries and expresses his fear that he feels he does not have much time left. There's no real attempt to comfort or soothe Hosea here. Dutch just kind of says, don't worry about it, we're all safe now. He's asking these people to disregard the past and just not worry about the future, and instead praise Dutch for the safety he has secured right now in this moment. All in all, Chapter 1 definitely does not have the most manipulative or selfish examples of Dutch's deliberate use of speech, but it does showcase very early on into the story that Dutch is very careful about what he says to certain people. Even something as simple as ignoring the gang's concerns and instead demanding their faith in his competency. So far, we haven't seen him get angry or really seen how this can lead to some pretty intense manipulation, just how he can get a little guilt trippy sometimes. But with that being said, let's get into Chapter 2 and some of the other speeches that we see Dutch deliver. Now, I've actually already made a TikTok video about this one, but I want to start this off by talking about the speech notes that you can find in the Horseshoe Overlook camp. I find this to be such a fascinating and deliberate detail amidst a game full of very deliberate detail. I definitely think that there's a reason the developers made this note and made it available for players to find. The first thing I noticed when finding this note is how scrambled and messy it looks. Half of this page has words that are crossed out, entire phrases that are taken back and rewritten. And while a little bizarre looking, it does tell us that Dutch is putting a lot of thought and effort into his speeches. Just the simple fact of writing it down in the first place tells us that he wants to plan it out. There's effort put into trying to organize and figure out what exactly he wants to communicate. Though I will say these sentences are a little bit stream of consciousness. They're a little all over the place. It does feel like Dutch is just writing the first thing that comes to mind, especially with the constant redaction and rephrasing and rewriting what he just wrote. But to be fair, I also think that that's important to note. I mentioned in my TikTok about these notes and even earlier in this video that Dutch always considers his audience when he's delivering these speeches or monologues. While there's no real consistency to what exactly he's crossing out, Dutch understands his audience well enough to know what needs to be included and what would be better left out. Dutch is not a man to speak very briefly, but I think he understands that the people that will be hearing this speech, his gang members in camp, don't need these complicated metaphors or confusing tangents. In fact, I would argue for some people in the gang, these really long, confusing metaphors would be counterintuitive, especially for the people that are more likely to take his word as gospel. It's the same reason why I find his decision to literally write in pauses so hilarious, but very deliberate as well. He wants these people to have to think about what he's saying. He is giving them time to sit with what he just said because it is just that deep and thought-provoking. Or maybe he just wants to give them time to cheer their support. I don't know, I wouldn't put it past him. I also find the final line in this note incredibly funny. Quote, "Then say something else about freedom." That quote of Miller's, "The whole point of America is freedom," etc. The idea of putting in enough thought to cross out his rambling and rephrase himself to sound more succinct and clear, but not even know how the hell he's gonna end it, is so funny to me. But I also think that showcases just how much confidence Dutch has in his own abilities. He just has this vague idea about quoting Evelyn Miller, who, might I just say, his influence on Dutch is an entirely separate can of worms that I could talk about on its own, and go into this speech knowing he wants to close it off with some profound statement about freedom, and he believes in himself enough to know that he can pull it off. He can always just pull something out of thin air and come up with something that proves his point. And in this case, he thinks that his audience is gullible enough to fall for whatever bullshit he can conjure. And that's really all it takes. When Dutch is confident in himself, there is no stopping him. He is going to speak, you are going to listen, and he is going to get the result he wants out of it, whether he has it fully planned out or not. Or at least I think he'd like to think that. And one of the biggest ways that he does this is by appealing to emotion. Some of the phrases he writes in these notes and then later says when he actually performs the speech showcase this. He brings up the people that they've lost just to proclaim that their deaths can't be for nothing. He continues to demand loyalty for whatever the hell it is he's fighting for. And he talks very condescendingly about people or thoughts or questions that could possibly express doubt. Dutch's respect is very dependent on whether or not you support him. We'll talk a little bit more about Dutch's tactics with other people in a bit, but there is most certainly a theme to his appeal to emotion. It's just more prominent with his gang because he knows these people. He knows that the bond here in this group is a strong one, and because his bond is so strong with them, he knows what works on them. I do find the reactions of the gang equally as interesting as well. We can witness Dutch perform so many speeches throughout the course of this game, but we only know what we see in 1899. The gang, however, has been with him for a very long time, some of them for decades. So there is no one who understands Dutch's tendency to speak as well as the people that follow him. It's not just that Dutch thinks he's a great speaker and knows that his strength lies there, but the gang seems to think this as well, even if there's some slight exasperation with it.
Dutch says a lot. That's his gift. Saying things.
We got Dutch. If there's anyone I reckon could convince good old St. Peter he got it wrong, it's Dutch.
Believe in old Bill here, because old Bill believes in Dutch.
Like I said at the beginning of this video, I don't bring all of this up to say that Dutch is some evil master manipulator, or even to get into the discussion of what he's trying to get from people. I just think his ability to do this is kind of crazy. Without much thought at all, he knows exactly what to say to incite a reaction in these people. If he thinks he can say something that will sway people's opinions or get the reaction or results that he desires, he's going to do it. Dutch is never as passionate as he is when he is delivering a speech. And that is what I find so fascinating. He is in his element during these times because of this crazy level of confidence that he has in his speaking abilities. And I feel throughout the course of this game that this confidence and strength in speaking comes from the fact that Dutch thinks that he is just simply smarter than most people. And there is no greater example of this than the events of chapters 3 and 4. Now, if you know me or you have seen my content before, then you probably know that I am the biggest Chapter 3 fan that there is. I think that Chapter 3 does an amazing job at showcasing Dutch's character. From the moment that Dutch steps foot in Lemoyne, he already has a ton of preconceived notions about the people that live there. Every time he interacts with the Greys, he just has to bring up how dumb and gullible and easy to trick they are. How Dutch and his gang will have zero problem robbing them blind. And there is no doubt or hesitation when he says all of this. He really truly believes that these people who he barely knows, and who he quite frankly has a ton of prejudice for, are so far below him that they couldn't possibly comprehend his 1000 IQ plan to rob them blind. This is veering into a different conversation about Dutch's character, so I'll get back on topic now. But I think it's important to note all of this and have an understanding of the prejudice Dutch has here so that we can understand how he manipulates language with these people. It's different from his appeal to emotion with the gang, who he has a much more intimate bond with. But anyway, in the Mission American Distillation, we see Dutch talk with a drunk Sheriff Gray before going on to destroy one of the Braithwaite's moonshine stills. I find this mission very telling for a few different reasons. For one, Dutch is overly placating and complimentary when he talks with the Grays, but it is not out of any desire to actually help them. It's condescending, and he's only doing it because he wants to get something out of these people. He repeatedly compliments Lemoyne and Rhodes. He pretends to view them as very smart and respectable people, and he entertains a lot of conversation with them. All things that we know that Dutch does not actually believe. And he has no problem turning around as soon as they're out of earshot and repeatedly telling Arthur how dumb and gullible they are. And this is notable for a few reasons as well. For one, it shows how two-faced and manipulative Dutch is, but that's not what we're focusing on in this video. It goes back to my point about Dutch considering his audience when he speaks. He knows that threatening violence and establishing himself as much smarter and more physically capable is not going to give him the outcome he wants. Instead, he plays into this decades-long familial feud, and he pretends to support these causes and ideas that he could not care less about. Threatening the sheriff is not going to make him submit and scared of Dutch and just let everything happen that Dutch wants to happen. But drinking with the sheriff while they complain about the Braithwaites will give Dutch an in. But I also want to bring to attention that tendency that Dutch has to turn around and immediately complain to Arthur. This is also a very telling use of language. He's trying to reinforce his own smarts and therefore the belief that his men might have about his smarts. Constantly bringing up his goal of double-crossing these families and how smart they are compared to the two of them not only reeks of overcompensation, but it gives his men reason to believe in him and his plans. After all, his men should have no reason to doubt him if he's fully confident in what he's doing. But as we know, Dutch is not successful in outsmarting either of these families. Instead, Sean is killed, Jack is kidnapped, and Dutch's ego has taken a huge hit. I'm not going to sit here and rehash the entire storyline of Chapter 3, but I'm sure that most of you are aware that it was a combination of the gang's ego and carelessness that led them to this end. They could not comprehend this group of Southerners possibly being privy to what was going on and thwarting their plans to rob them blind. And that is exactly what has led them to this unfortunate spot that they're in when they go to storm the Braithwaite Manor. While on their way to do so, the gang sort of deliberates what had led them to this point. This pursuit for something that didn't even exist. John scolds Hosea for trying to pull a scheme on these people and the resulting consequences that have come from that, in which Hosea states the obvious fact that the gang had completely underestimated these families. Dutch interjects, not to defend his partner, but to say this.
No, they underestimated us. Enough talk. There is no point arguing how we got here. This is where we are, and we are going to fix it.
More deflection. More of Dutch avoiding the blame that he shares. Instead of admitting that he was blinded by this pursuit of riches, or apologizing to John in any way for the actions that he's taken that have resulted in John's child being taken, he tells them to stop talking about it. Which, to be fair, not to play devil's advocate, he could be telling them to just stop arguing with each other and redirect their anger towards the enemy, which is what they need to do at this point. It's just convenient that they are told to drop the subject when they start talking about blame. Funny how that works. And a similar thing happens when Dutch and the gang actually approach the Braithwaite Manor. The Braithwaites accuse Dutch and his men of meddling in their business, insinuating that that's why they took Jack, for retaliation. Dutch responds with this.
Whatever complaint you have with us, alleged or otherwise,
Even though he's fully aware that these people know what he's done, and there is no point in lying or trying to defend against the obvious truth, he still cannot admit fault. Admitting fault means admitting that he was outsmarted and played the fool. Admitting fault means admitting he made mistakes. And we all know that Dutch would rather die than admit he was wrong. So instead, he talks very carefully so he can acknowledge their anger, but not acknowledge that he was the one causing it. And this certainly is not the only time we see him do this, but we'll get to that in a minute. As a final thought on Dutch's language with the families of Rhodes, I want to point out how Dutch insults Catherine Braithwaite once they finally come face to face. The entirety of Chapter 3 thus far has been spent listening to Dutch constantly insult these families for their smarts, for being gullible idiots. But now that he's been outsmarted, Dutch chooses to insult what he knows Catherine is most proud of: her family, her assets, and her lineage. He calls her home, something we know she's very attached to because her family has lived in for years, a dump. He assures her that he will go on to kill the rest of her children. He calls them all inbred trash. Now that physical violence has taken place, there is no more placating. He makes all the threats and spews all the insults that he wants. I keep bringing up the fact that Dutch uses emotion to appeal to people, but being aware of people's emotions and vulnerabilities means that he knows exactly what to say to really piss somebody off. Though he does spew his fair share of broad insults, he knows where to focus in and really hurt. And this is only one example of that. Hi, Editing Jay here. I was going through this, and as I was, compiling like the gameplay footage to put for the B-roll, this specific line made me think about the interaction between Colm O'Driscoll and Dutch in their little like parlay situation. And Colm says the line, "How's that score you stole off us?" or whatever it is, and Dutch just very simply, very casually responds, "Which one?" Obviously, that is just petty, and it's petty for the sake of being petty, but we have the context of knowing that Dutch and Colm have a very, very long-standing rivalry. They have this hatred for each other that goes back a very long time, and that sort of furthers my point. Dutch knows Colm, and even though they are enemies, they still know each other. They know what gets under the other man's skin. They know what to say to piss the other man off. Dutch saying this, Dutch using that very specific insult, is not only trying to prove that Colm isn't getting under his skin, but Dutch wants to feel like the one in charge. This is a situation that he did not set up, he is walking into, but he wants to feel in control. So what does he do? He brings up the fact that he has been more successful than Colm, that he's been stealing scores off of Colm for a very long time, and that is used to deliberately make Colm feel uncomfortable, make Colm feel angry, whatever, however. We see Dutch do this with multiple characters, like I said, but I feel as though Chapter 3 is where it kind of happens the most, or at the very least it starts to become very apparent. So I was just thinking about it while I was editing. I wanted to insert that in here really quick. Anyway, back to it. To quite literally sum up Chapter 3, there's a few interesting moments that I want to point out after this mission.
Now, I don't expect you to understand this, but I have never been more proud of you than I am right now, brother.
In my video about fatherhood, I explained the importance and impact of Dutch's use of the words brother and son, particularly with people like Arthur and John. So if you want a much more deeper, detailed exploration of that, I highly recommend just going and watching that video. All I'll say here is I think that Dutch calling John brother in this moment is very deliberate. He's trying to establish John as an equal while also reassuring that John has his support. And he does this because John is, very understandably, expressing some hesitation and fear about what to do next. Instead of acknowledging his fault and his mistakes that have led to Jack's kidnapping, Dutch comes up with this very carefully worded sentence that's both condescending and complimentary at the same time. "I don't expect you to understand this, because John can't possibly think the way that Dutch does, or possibly understand what Dutch could be thinking. And yet, he's never been more proud than he is right now, brother." It's thanking John for believing in and standing beside Dutch as a brother in arms, even if he can't possibly comprehend how Dutch's mind works. Yet again, he manages to avoid accountability and admitting where he holds blame, and continues to hold the support of his men. And I think a big part of that comes from the fact that he knows how to skirt around accountability and admitting his faults, and he knows how to rile up his men and divert from the conversation entirely. But the big thing here that I want to bring to attention is the confrontation when Agent Ross and Agent Milton show up at the Clemens Point camp. Milton goes into his usual drivel about Dutch and his men and their incapability to act civilized and behave as normal humans and have decency. And Dutch responds with his usual drivel about American freedom and human greed. This particular interaction and the debate that they have about human morality isn't entirely unique, but I think it's a good representation of how Dutch uses his philosophy to put himself up on a pedestal. When he's insulted about his behavior, particularly by an enforcement group who look down on his way of life, it's almost like he feels as if he has to prove his intelligence. He has to prove his intelligence and his capacity to think and dream about what America really is. Milton, of course, is not hearing this. Despite Dutch's convincing claims, he accuses the man of being nothing more than a killer. A charming man who has wrangled in these lost souls in a pursuit for violence. And while Dutch uses deliberately insulting words to sort of mock Milton's attitude here, he never directly threatens them with any kind of violence. Sure, the people around him make their intentions pretty well known with a wordless whip of their guns, but Dutch himself never makes a threat of violence. Another very intentional decision. I'd argue that the deliberate use of words extends to deliberate silence as well, because he'll have these sort of pseudo-intellectual debates and try his hardest to establish himself as some sort of revolutionary figure that's chasing a goal far beyond these men's comprehension. But he knows better than to make a threat against them. If he were to tell these men that he wished to harm them, it would just prove their point. It would give them every reason to believe their own claims about Dutch being this crazed, violent man. It would justify their desire to chase, arrest, or even harm him. I definitely don't think that Dutch always makes the smartest decisions, but he does recognize what's in his best interest when he comes face to face with the Pinkertons. Anyway, enough of me over-explaining and ruminating on Chapter 3. Let's move on to what I would consider one of the greatest dynamics that Dutch has in this game, and what that dynamic reveals about Dutch's speech abilities. Angelo Bronte. I could make an entire video just on Angelo Bronte. Honestly, I could probably make an entire video just about Dutch's dynamic with Bronte. If you've been following me for a while, you know I've said it 1,000 times. I think their dynamic is one of the most fascinating and interesting parts of this entire game. There's just so much that could be said about the two of them. How much they mirror each other, or Dutch's obvious envy for Bronte's status and power. But let's just stay on topic for now. The initial confrontation between the two of them is a shining example of how much Dutch depends on his ability to speak to override any kind of tension. It's a little different from the previous examples we've discussed, in that Dutch storms into Bronte's home with Arthur and John on his side, very obviously upset. The only thing that Dutch knows about Bronte at this point is Bronte's status and power in Saint Denis. He has all the signs of a very powerful man, sure, but Dutch doesn't know quite how deep that influence goes. So he walks in there, threatens the life of Bronte and his men, and fully prepares himself for a gunfight. But Bronte is not a man that Dutch can just push around however he pleases. He will not be intimidated by threats, especially in his own territory, and especially in his own home. Bronte stands on business and tells Dutch that this is not going to happen. Bronte is the one in charge here. Dutch clearly does not expect that response, nor the way that Bronte goes on to insult all of them, something we will continue to see Bronte do very often and very obviously annoy Dutch very deeply. But in return, Dutch does not pursue more violence. He goes on to concede, but not without asserting his innocence in the matter. They had quarrel with the Braithwaites, not Bronte. The entire interaction here that happens afterwards is actually what inspired me to make this video.
Indeed you have. Now, we are simple country folk. All we have is each other. And you have gone and you have took his son over some dispute with some inbred ex-slavers. It ain't got nothing to do with any one of us.
You had nothing to do with destroying the liquor business!
We was innocent bystanders. And that which we weren't innocent of, well, we most surely were ignorant of.
You twist words, you lie shamelessly, you think you are better than everyone else.
This has just always stuck out to me. From Dutch's defense to the way that Bronte reacts, it's just a very blunt telling to the audience of everything that Dutch is about. He does twist words, he does lie shamelessly, and he does think he's better than everyone else. Bronte has known Dutch for about 10 seconds, and he already has such a perfect grasp on that man's character. Birds of a feather and all that. Once Dutch, John, and Arthur have Jack safely returned to them and they go on their way to safely return to Shady Belle, Dutch and Arthur start to discuss the events of the night. While Arthur is disgruntled over the fiasco that had happened in the graveyard that ended in him and John nearly getting shot by the police, Dutch could not be more pleased. His worst gripe of the night is just that Angelo Bronte is an intolerable blowhard, but he stocks a good bar, so, you know. Not only does this go to show just how fickle Dutch is once somebody shows him the slightest bit of praise or adoration, but Dutch goes on to blatantly ignore and even poke fun at Arthur for being concerned about getting shot by the police. When Arthur responds with what I can only describe as exasperation, Dutch says this.
Each to their strengths, Arthur. I went in there with a gun and left with a party invitation.
Now, I could read Dutch to filth about how conceited and arrogant this makes him sound. But the point I want to make is how Dutch admits here that speech is his strength. I would even argue that him saying it like this insinuates that this is a strength he possesses and nobody else does. Arthur and John are more physically capable, and that is where their strongest assets lie. That's why they went on to perform a physical task and succeed at it. Dutch is more proficient and more comfortable speaking. It's not like he can't perform these physical tasks and go out with his men and go fighting and shooting people, but why would he when he feels like he's getting what he wants and manipulating a very powerful man simply by speaking with him? Talking allows him to fundamentally skew opinions and change the situation and change what could have been a very bad outcome. Hence why he's so proud to have walked out of there with an invitation to the mayor's gala. That wouldn't have happened had they continued to go in there guns blazing, no holds barred. Because, you know, if history serves us right, Dutch has only ever been successful when it comes to tricking powerful people. Right? Anyways, we see as Dutch continues to be very careful and deliberate about the way he speaks about Bronte. After getting repeatedly humiliated and realizing that Bronte could not give less of a shit who Dutch Vanderlyn is and what he stands for, Dutch becomes the main force against him. When debating with Hosea whether or not they should take Bronte out, Hosea is staunchly against the idea. It won't solve anything, and it will ultimately only end in more problems than solutions. Pretty reasonable, I would say. But Dutch insists that this is the right thing to do if they want to be successful robbing the Lemoyne State Bank. It's not necessarily their argument that I care about, but rather the fact that they're having this debate in front of Arthur. Arthur, who rarely, if ever, argues with Dutch's point. Arthur, who rarely, if ever, contests Dutch's beliefs. Dutch goes on to say that Bronte's men are gunning for them in a deliberate attempt to make Bronte's defensiveness sound like some sort of personal vendetta against Dutch and the gang. He goes on to call Bronte a, quote, vindictive little power broker who rules by fear, saying he knows how men like this operate, and that's why he's so insistent that Bronte needs to be taken out. I don't bring all of this up just to highlight Dutch's insults against him, even if I don't necessarily disagree with them. I bring it up because of the reasoning. Despite his denial,
This ain't about revenge, Hosea. Angelo Bronte don't mean shit to me.
we know that Dutch harbors a lot of disdain for Bronte. Using the particular insults that he does, calling out the man's morals, saying the city he controls is a cesspit, and making it sound like he has a personal gripe with the gang, is meant to incite anger. It's meant to make the listener, in this case Arthur, view Bronte in a negative light. Dutch is using this intentionally negative language to prove his point and make his argument. And as the argument goes on, Dutch continues to deflect Hosea's points and worry by saying that this is the last job they will ever have to do. We are witnessing this man who has consistently prided himself on his morals, who has imprinted those morals onto children and vulnerable people who have placed their lives in his hands, now ignore his partner when his actions are brought into question for going against those morals. He simply states that this is the last job they will ever have to do. It doesn't resolve anything, it just allows him to walk away and not confront or admit any of his faults or his blatant hypocrisy here. Now, this is not a huge detail in the grand scheme of things. It's not even a huge detail in the grand scheme of this chapter, but I want to talk a little bit about Dutch and Arthur's ride to Le Gras after deciding they should take out Bronte. I think the conversation that they have here is pretty interesting. Most of it is paranoia paranoia on Dutch's end, I will say that. He's upset and worried about the doubt that some of the members of the gang have been expressing, particularly Arthur. And he expresses his frustration with Hosea for arguing with him about what the purpose of what he's doing is. So I will say I do think a lot of this is just angry and impulsive rambling, but in that vein, I do think that he is saying what he's saying to incite a reaction out of Arthur. It's honestly not too different from what we witnessed when Dutch was purposefully trying to insult Catherine Braithwaite with very intentional, hard-hitting insults. A good example of this is when Arthur asks what Dutch's intentions are with Bronte. Dutch has a lot of emotion at this question, and he asserts that it does not really matter. What matters is getting rid of Bronte, and given everything that man has done, the reason should not be important. But as Dutch goes on to list all of these offenses that Bronte has committed, it doesn't really feel like he's upset about what Bronte's done, but rather that Arthur is questioning him, which is why he repeatedly states that the reasons here don't matter. It's what Dutch wants to do, so it's what they're going to do. Dutch goes on to just repeatedly guilt trip Arthur. Let's just call it what it is. I have to work so hard supporting 20-something people and breaking my back to make sure that all of you stay safe. Something he chose to do, by the way. But I want to point out here that Dutch places a lot of the blame on Arthur for insinuating that his doubt, which at this point is just mild hesitance, is what's causing these plans to fall apart. And Dutch knows that loyalty is the biggest thing that Arthur has offered him, especially after 20-something long years of following him. So pointing the finger at him and insinuating that it's Arthur's lack of support that's caused all this hardship and this increasingly more stressful situation for Dutch is such a shitty thing to do. But what really gets me is when Dutch goes on to say that Micah is the most loyal member of the gang right now.
I feel like I'm going in circles with all of you. Micah is the only one left with any loyalty.
Now, I do think that there is part of Dutch that genuinely believes this at this point, but I think his bigger intention in saying this is to incite a reaction in Arthur. Because not only is there no reason to insinuate that Arthur is any less loyal at this point, especially compared to a man that Dutch has only known for 6 months, but Dutch also knows that Arthur does not like Micah. I have always viewed this interaction as Dutch wanting to incite jealousy in Arthur. He has always known Arthur to be the most dedicated man. He has admitted multiple times by this point in the story that he views Arthur as a son. So by implying that there's somebody who's more loyal, a man who he does not like, no less, almost feels like he wants Arthur to prove his loyalty. Even when he goes on to apologize, it does not feel like an apology. Like all of the deflection we've talked about before, he does not acknowledge how irrational he's being or how rude he's been talking to Arthur. He justifies his own anger by saying that Arthur caused it by being doubtful. If he feels that one of his best men is failing to support him, he's going to say whatever he can to get that man inspired to prove his loyalty. And that is exactly what this feels like. The final thing I want to talk about in this chapter actually comes after Bronte's death. To be honest, I don't actually have a lot to say about the actual confrontation between Dutch and Bronte. Bronte does most of the speaking there, and I really just think the whole thing is meant to highlight a lot of Dutch's insecurity and the envy that he felt for Bronte, which, as I keep saying, not the conversation we're having today. What I find interesting is the interaction that Dutch and John have afterwards. John is clearly affected by the level of violence that he has just witnessed Dutch commit. Yet again, Dutch is confronted with his actions being very hypocritical of the morals he prides himself on. Instead of deflecting this time, though, Dutch asserts that he knows better than John.
Part of your philosophy books cover feeding a fella to a goddamn alligator, Dutch.
Part that covers weakness. That part.
I don't know.
Well, I do. It ain't nice. I know it. But it is us or him. I figure it might as well be him.
Knowing the dynamic between Dutch and John at this point, and understanding the authoritative and borderline parental status that Dutch has over John, makes this whole thing a lot more interesting. Had Dutch deflected here and attempted to change the conversation, you could argue that that might indicate some kind of guilt. At the very least, it would feel like a much calmer attempt at control that would be more in line with what we've seen Dutch do so far. Instead, he chooses to deliberately challenge John's confrontation. He states that he knows better and he made this decision for the greater good of the gang. It is a much more assertive and stern attempt to regain control in the face of a lot of people's hesitation. As circumstances get worse for the gang, Dutch grows increasingly more agitated and a lot less patient with the people who express any kind of hesitation. He does not have time for the people that don't blindly support him and just ignore all of the mistakes he makes. With that, we see his speech grow a lot more assertive in turn. There's less flowery language and a lot more guilt tripping. And while I feel this started with the Braithwaite incident, we have only seen it fester and grow when it comes to this situation with Bronte. Unfortunately, the tension and agitation only continues to grow with every new thing the gang comes across. We see in his speech that Dutch feels as though he is losing more and more control. So let's look at some of Dutch's conversations in Chapter 5 when he has almost no control over what's going on. I honestly hesitate to talk about the interaction with Gloria just because it is so heavily memed and joked about, but I really do genuinely think that this scene does such a good job at showcasing Dutch's character and mindset at this point in the game. Everything about it can be broken down and overanalyzed, and there's certainly a much larger conversation at play here. You know, you could talk about Dutch's personality, his mindset, his character, everything. There's a lot. Maybe one day I'll make a 10-hour video dissecting every part of him, but that is not happening right now. For now, let's just look at some of the things Dutch says in this interaction. After Dutch gets rid of Gloria and Arthur confronts him about his increasingly violent behavior, Dutch justifies himself by saying that it's for their safety and survival. More deflection of blame. He attempts to divert the conversation, but it's very clear that Arthur does not believe this excuse. Dutch goes on to ask, "Do you think I wanted any of this?" Surface level, that seems like Dutch is admitting that what he did was wrong. It was wrong, but he feels terrible about doing it. He's only been doing these terrible things that he feels bad about because he's been trying so hard to keep him and his men alive. But really, what this does is just place blame on Arthur for possibly thinking that Dutch could do something so terrible in cold blood. So, when Arthur asks for an explanation by asking what Gloria had said that tipped him off, Dutch decides to say that it was her behavior. Arthur immediately clocks this, however, and confronts him about his lie. So Dutch goes on to say this.
I know human beings, Arthur.
Not only does he sound extremely condescending here, because Dutch is saying that he simply understands more because he has more wisdom or experience or understanding than Arthur does. But it's almost as if Dutch wants Arthur to feel unsure about his own judgment. Arthur simply couldn't understand how this woman could have betrayed them, or how Dutch could have been aware of it. But Dutch could sense it, and that's why he's the one in charge. It's a very simple 5 words, but it communicates so much more. Arthur did not make the call. He can't even understand the reasonings behind the call. Therefore, he needs to drop the conversation and move on. Now, Dutch could have very easily admitted that he did what he did because he just wanted to get their final gold bar back, or this woman was a loose end who saw their faces and who knows who she could have told. He could have come up with anything else that would have made Arthur feel a little less uneasy, but Dutch goes so far as to insult this woman after her death as if to justify his action. He's trying his hardest to paint this woman in a bad light to make himself or Arthur or both of them feel better about what he did. This was an elderly woman who was half his size with a little knife. I don't care who you are, I don't care what you say. This woman did not pose any threat to Dutch. He did not have to do what he did. And despite Arthur witnessing that and verbally expressing his distaste with it, Dutch is still very careful about not admitting fault. Even if he subtly acknowledges what he did, there's a reason behind it. Anyways, let's skip forward to the gang's escape from Gorma. As the 5 men are on the boat back to America, they sort of deliberate over what their next steps are going to be. As Dutch justifies his plan to return to Lemoyne, where they had just escaped from, he says,
We ain't even played our hand yet. We just need to put some more money in our pockets. Make our escape. Broke, alone, they're gonna pick us off one by one, and you know it.
Maybe.
Not maybe.
He is completely undermining how difficult this task will actually be to pull off. He says it like it's just some simple task. And sure, maybe that's just to keep spirits high and keep his men motivated after everything that has happened, but he ends up putting a lot of emphasis on unity. He's attempting to instill this idea in his men that if they don't stick together, if they don't get more money, they are going to be apprehended. He's reinforcing this idea of faith and loyalty. If you leave, we're gonna get caught. It's fear-mongering. Javier, for the first time ever, interjects and expresses his concern with how the gang has been acting recently. He questions their recent actions and the gang's sudden turn to violence. Dutch responds by saying, "We've been in a bad way." Notice how the one time he seems to actually admit some fault, he has to share it with the rest of the gang. He's not saying that his idea or his actions have caused this sudden shift to violence. He's not acknowledging that he has been the one heralding some of these violent ideas and violent actions that have been taken. It's everyone's fault for going along with it. He goes on to deliver this little monologue that I'll just show you here.
Listen, I will kill for my family. Any of you want to judge me for that? That's fine, but that is who I am. Anyone disagree? Anyone?
This is a little bit more reminiscent of the confrontation between Arthur and Dutch that we discussed earlier. Dutch acknowledges his more distasteful actions, but he hides it behind this guise of love and concern for his men, this desire he has to keep everybody safe. And he invites the rest of his men to try and argue against him and try to say that he's some bad or evil person for simply trying to keep his gang safe and alive. Extremely guilt-trippy. Like we've been saying, as time goes on and Dutch grows increasingly more violent and has less patience for doubt and hesitation, he gets more and more blunt with his words. We might think it a good thing that he's deciding to finally be honest about some of his more violent or harmful actions, but anytime he does, he has to follow it up with some kind of bullshit justification, typically some form of self-preservation. Framing it that way allows him to sort of guilt-trip his men. Look what I'm doing to keep you safe, and all you're deciding to do in return is question me and waver in your loyalty. It's an extremely tense and very manipulative use of language, and it clearly betrays how paranoid he's becoming. And with that in mind, let's look at some scenes from the final chapter of Red Dead 2. There is a lot to talk about when it comes to Dutch's character in Chapter 6. In terms of his language, it's definitely a lot more manipulative, and his blatant lies become much more apparent than they ever have. He's much more angry and agitated with his men, but despite those vulnerable moments where we do see the mask slip a little bit, we still see plenty of moments where he's scheming and very carefully choosing what he's saying. The biggest example of this, and unfortunately biggest victim of it, is Eagleflies. A lot of the dynamic between Dutch and Eagleflies comes from the more authoritative and mentorly position that Dutch has over the other man. Sorry to keep bringing up my last video, but if you want a deeper look at the more specific manipulation at play here and how Dutch uses his position and status to extort Eagleflies' systemic oppression and poor relationship with his father, Rainsfall, then I do highly recommend just checking that video out. I'm gonna avoid bringing up the examples I presented in that video for sake of not repeating myself, and instead I want to look at some of the empty promises and encouragement that Dutch gives to Eagleflies, and how he uses his words very carefully to avoid any kind of blame or suspicion that he might be doing all of this for himself. Right off the bat, I find the very first meeting between Dutch and Eagleflies a very deliberate show of Dutch's power. He tells Eagleflies to put away his money and asserts that he never made such promises to not get in conflict with the army or the American government. Now, he does not outright state that he's going to indulge in violent activity or create some kind of big conflict, but he is encouraging the impulsive decisions that Eagleflies wants to make under the guise of guiding this young man to stand his own ground. Based on some later conversations, we can assume that Dutch understands how angry Eagleflies is here, and he knows there is a long-standing conflict between the Native Americans and the American army. money, and he is extorting it. Now, I am not going to dissect every single piece of dialogue between Dutch and Eagleflies because we would be here for 5 hours, but the main point between most of it stays the same. Dutch encourages a lot of Eagleflies' anger and impulsivity with very carefully worded support. He makes it seem as if he's helping out of the kindness of his heart, but we, the player, and other characters such as Arthur and Charles, understand that Dutch is doing all of this for his own benefit. It's reminiscent of the conflict in Chapter 3 with the Greys and Braithwaites. Dutch says one thing to the people that he's trying to convince, and then turns around and says another to Arthur. Also, something that feels like a pretty big detail, Dutch never directly states how he feels about the conflict between the Native Americans and the army. He never technically gives his own opinion. He never once says that what the army is doing is wrong and unjust and unfair. Never once do we hear him say anything along the lines of, "Wow, Eagleflies, it's really messed up what the army is doing to you." He simply just affirms the anger that Eagleflies expresses and kind of relates to it by saying that the gang has their own problems with the American government. He asks rhetorical questions like,
I like you, son. And after the horses, are we gonna wait for the army to come and wreak its revenge?
he prompts Eagleflies for responses. Talking like this allows Eagleflies to think that he was the one who came up with these plans or is fronting a lot of these ideas, when in actuality, it's Dutch planting the seeds. Instead of being upfront about how unbalanced and unfair these fights are, Dutch phrases these plans and acts against the army as rebellion and reinforces the idea that this is something worth being a martyr for. I want to bring attention to a line in the mission Favored Sons. After Arthur confronts Dutch for using the Native Americans for his own benefit, Dutch says this.
No, sir. No. Never. But it is mutually beneficial to draw attention to one problem and a veil over another.
Even though he's been open with Arthur about his intentions, including using the Native American situation as a distraction so that they can make their escape out of the country, he still can't admit that. He cannot admit that that is quite literally using them. He has to dress it up a little bit and make it sound a lot softer than it is. You know, the army was worrying about the Native Americans anyway. Dutch is just focusing their attention. Doesn't that sound nicer than admitting that he's inciting violence in a group of people that's already targeted? Good on you, Dutch. And in that vein, the final thing I want to bring up in this whole Eagleflies debacle is in one of the final missions of Chapter 6. In the mission My Last Boy, after Eaglefly sacrifices himself to save Arthur, Dutch is confronted by Arthur for having left him behind. The only refusal that Dutch offers is, "I did no such thing, don't be a fool." And listen, I hate how overused and watered down this word has become. Do not crucify me, but this is quite literally textbook gaslighting. I think a few of the examples we've talked about could be examples of gaslighting, but this here is certainly one of the biggest offenses. Dutch doesn't just deny what he's been accused of, he insults Arthur for having suggested it. In a time where everyone is becoming more aware of how sick Arthur is, Dutch is insinuating that Arthur is just simply misunderstanding what happened, because Dutch would never do that. The only thing he wants to focus on is the money he's procured, and he sounds so proud of himself for having successfully pulled this off. So they can't sit here and argue about what just happened, unless it's to talk about the success they had in getting money. There's a scene in this mission that always manages to stick out in my head when I think of it. The image of Eagleflies being hoisted onto a horse as he is actively bleeding out and dying, and Dutch tapping his temple as he proclaims, "Everything is coming together exactly as I planned." What this is plausible deniability. He is not directly stating that Arthur nearly dying and Eagleflies himself being shot was what he planned, nor does he state that he planned for the Native Americans to suffer a loss here. But by bringing up the bonds that they found, Dutch is shifting the focus. He's not talking about all of the harm that his plan has caused, but instead focusing on the success he has procured. Of course, that was what he planned, getting money to get the gang out of America. Or at least, that's what he would tell you. He doesn't acknowledge the consequences that will befall the Native Americans for this. He doesn't even acknowledge that Eagleflies is dying. He just tells his men to get ready and prepare for the next train robbery, because that is all he cares about. Okay, I love eagle flies, but let's talk about some other aspects of chapter 6 that I think really emulate Dutch's special use of words. For example, when Arthur and Sadie break John out of Sisika, he is immediately met with frustration by Dutch. This tells us a few things. Mainly that Dutch is upset that this didn't happen on his terms. This whole interaction, I feel, is meant to show us how Dutch reacts when he is really being challenged by his men. He's already extremely paranoid, but now one of his best men is going behind his back to rescue one of the men that he thinks is plotting against him. So, of course, he places that blame on Arthur. This is one of the first times that we truly see Dutch really yell at them, instead of possibly trying to understand where Arthur could be coming from, in realizing that there was a very real possibility that John could have been hanged. He instead decides to guilt trip them yet again by bringing up loyalty. He says that this decision is now going to end with the rest of them being hanged. And what really gets me about all of this is when Dutch tries to play nice to John and tries to reassure that he had a plan and he was coming for him. He's trying to make John feel bad about being afraid, for possibly doubting Dutch's intentions here. He dramatically emphasizes the fact that there was just merely talk of John hanging, and this is done to make both of them feel bad about their fear and their decision to go behind Dutch's back and against his wishes. I can't really say if Dutch actually thought that this would end up bringing attention from the law, but regardless, he has now completely placed the blame on the two of them and has decided that if the law comes, it is 100% their fault. And finally, I want to talk about the sort of infamous conversation that Dutch and Arthur have in the mission Our Best Selves. In this, Arthur tries to advocate for the women in Jack, insisting that they be let go. Dutch's response?
Well, then
There
maybe
ain't
we
no
can...
freedom for no one in this country no more, Arthur.
It's honestly hard to say if this is just Dutch's delusion about how the world works and he actually genuinely thinks that this is what will happen, or if this is just more manipulation to keep Arthur and the rest of the gang on his side. But assuming the latter, Dutch is almost insulting Arthur's wish here by claiming that there is no point in letting anybody leave because America simply is not free. Wording it this way insinuates that whatever could be waiting for the people that dare defect is infinitely worse than whatever Dutch could have planned. Yet again, he's fear-mongering. Not too unlike the conversation we saw back on the boat when they were returning to America. He's not outright saying that America is scary and dangerous and there's gonna be law and death waiting on every corner if these people leave. But he's doubling down on this idea that America isn't free. This country just will not allow them to live the way that they want, which is the very idea that the gang was founded on. So, as long as that's the case, they need to stick together and fight till the end, because the alternative is no real way to live. I also want to point out how often Dutch asserts that everything is going to plan. This might be true, or at the very least something Dutch believes, but it's almost like he feels as if he has to keep saying it to convince Arthur. He has to argue against every single doubtful thought that Arthur has, against every single bit of hesitation, and even against the valid criticisms that Arthur brings up. Doing all of that, coupled with all of the fear he has instilled about leaving, is a very desperate attempt to keep these people at his side for as long as possible. He clearly does not care for or respect Arthur as much as he once did, but he is clinging on to the people that he has left after so much has gone wrong. What better way to assure them that they need to stay when the alternative is bad, and not only does he have a plan, but the plan is working. There really isn't too much to say about the actual ending of the game, considering Dutch doesn't really talk all that much. All he really does is get angry and argue and yell, and in the end, he just walks away silently like a coward. The only thing I can really think of is in the epilogue during American Venom, when John begs Dutch to just say something in the midst of this three-way standoff that they're in. Dutch very simply responds with, "I ain't got too much to say no more," before shooting Micah. Not only is this one of the few times that I will applaud Dutch for something, I think that this line is a very Dutch thing to say that tells us that he is regretful and he has given up. Dutch has always prided himself on his speech. It's his biggest strength, as is evidenced by everything we've been talking about so far. To say that he no longer has anything to talk about is a pretty heavy statement. He doesn't have the strength, the confidence, the support. He doesn't have anything. he used to. There isn't anything left to say, especially to John, who was there and witnessed the entire thing. All that's left is to act, which he finally does in this moment. There was no talking himself out of the situation. There was no leaving without violence. There was no moment for Dutch to deliver a big speech or monologue. This is a man who has lost everything and no longer has anything left to say. Now, for the last chapter of this video, I want to get into Dutch as we see him in the first game. Because although he's a very different man and he doesn't depend on his speech as much as he used to throughout the course of the second game, I still think some of the things he says are worth discussing, and that fall from grace, or perhaps blossoming of his true self, depending on how you view it, and how he feels about his own speech is pretty important. Now, straight up, I just don't have as much to say about the first game as I do the second, simply because Dutch just isn't in as much of the first game as he is the second. But a big aspect of Dutch's character in the first game is that he no longer depends on his speech like he did throughout the story of the second game. Don't get me wrong, he still loves to talk, and considering he's managed to manipulate a group of young Native American men into following him, he must still be working his charm somehow. But he certainly isn't doing it to the degree that he once used to. He depends much more on his violent reputation and his physical capabilities at this point. It feels as though that line from American Venom has stuck with him for all these years. In the mission, the prodigal son returns to Yale. Dutch threatens both John and Professor McDougal, and he does this just for the hell of it. And that right there is exactly what I want to point out. He's no longer pretending or dressing up what his intentions are by hiding them behind some kind of bigger goal or bigger plan. He is saying he is going to kill the man he used to run in a gang with for a decade simply because it will entertain him. It is simply sport to him. But anyway, the main thing I want to focus on here is a line that Dutch says in response to John. When Dutch proclaims that he and his men are fighting for an idea, a statement that is very reminiscent of the way he used to speak in the second game, this is the interaction that ensues.
Only we're fighting for an idea, not just for ourselves.
That's beautiful, Dutch. You always were a fine speaker.
I was.
Two things to point out here. John commenting on Dutch's speaking abilities only reinforces the idea that Dutch would speak so often that he had such a reputation for it that the people around him were familiar with it. But it's Dutch's response, this almost melancholic agreement he has, that sticks out to me. We do actually see how Dutch continues to twist words and paint certain narratives in this game, not too unlike what we see in the second game. So it's interesting that Dutch says he used to be a good speaker. The only real difference is he's not doing it as often. Maybe it's not as effective as it used to be either. I actually made a TikTok about this exact scene the other day, and a few people in my comments proposed some theories as to why Dutch might say this as well, so I want to present a few of those to you. For one, it's possible Dutch agrees he used to be a good speaker because he's trying to distance himself from the past and that version of himself. That man lost a lot of his men, almost all of the money he fought for, and all of the support that he garnered over 20 years of operating. That man lost everything. But the Dutch van der Linde we see in 1911 isn't intending to fail, and perhaps he recognizes that he needs to do more than depend on his words at this point. Or perhaps it's because of all the loss that he faced that he no longer thinks he's a good speaker. He knew that by the end of the gang's time together that not a lot of people believed in him and his words. Doubt was a big thing that he struggled with. It's possible that losing all the support that he had for so long convinced him that his words just weren't any good anymore. He can't prove himself with just his words anymore. He has to prove himself with his actions instead. It's like the saying, actions speak louder than words, finally got through his head. That was a little bit of a tangent, sorry, but I do think it's worth discussing, because the use of the past tense and his almost sad tone is intentional. But anyway, let's get back on topic now and look at some examples of Dutch actually manipulating language. A scene from the first game that I think really encapsulates this entire topic is the bank confrontation in the mission Great Men Are Not Always Wise. The way that Dutch speaks to John in this mission is so infuriating that it pisses me off. And I think a lot of that stems from the fact that he is trying to get a rise out of John in this situation. He is trying to get a certain reaction and trying to paint a particular narrative. He's just rage baiting. I mean, right off the bat, the first thing Dutch does is bring up Abigail and Jack. he's taunting John for being a family man. And with the context of the second game in mind, we know that Dutch harbored a lot of resentment towards Abigail because he believed that Abigail was pulling John away from him. So deliberately bringing up Abigail and Jack in this confrontation, it's not only an intentional dig at what Dutch had viewed as betrayal, he's bringing up the long-standing history that Dutch has with John. And when John reminds Dutch that John's priorities had shifted once Dutch had left him to die, Dutch excuses himself by saying,
We all make mistakes, John. I never claimed to be a saint.
I really don't have to explain how that's a shitty thing to say. What I find even more infuriating is the next line in which Dutch laughs and calls John an errand boy. Context comes pretty heavily into play here. Knowing that John ran with Dutch for over a decade on this foundational idea of men being free and rejecting the government's control makes this hit a lot harder, especially when we saw them running from the Pinkertons together throughout the course of the second game. He's not just calling John an errand boy to insinuate that he can't operate without orders and thus calling into question his masculinity. He's purposefully calling John's integrity and morals into question, which we also know from the second game is something that John and Dutch bickered over. But John refuses to give Dutch any real reaction and insists that he needs to let the woman he's holding hostage go. Dutch goes on to say that John was always a romantic, a line that I find very interesting because no the hell he was not, and calls out the fact that John's wife was once a prostitute. Now, this is a line that I have gotten into many an argument over. And for the sake of staying on topic and protecting my sanity, I am not going to get into the debate of whether or not I think Dutch was telling the truth here when he says that he and the rest of the men slept with Abigail. What I am going to point out is that Dutch is saying this to deliberately humiliate John. He is trying to humiliate John in front of a room full of men who do not know the entire context. The only people who know the truth of the matter and who all actually slept with Abigail is John and Dutch. Truthfully, it does not matter, and it does not change anything here either way, but Dutch brings it up to deliberately poke at John's masculinity. I would say that this is a facet of the time period, but unfortunately this is something that is still brought up to this day. It is seen as embarrassing to have a significant other who is either in sex work or has a history with it. The Pinkertons and the men working with them and the Native American men in the room do not have any idea what the truth of the situation is. They do not have any context of what John, Dutch, and Abigail's relationships were. For all they know, Dutch is telling the truth. Again, it truly does not matter. What does matter is the intention. And the intention here is to make John look weak or less masculine, or insinuate that his integrity isn't as strong as he presents it to be. Dutch goes on to play into this idea by claiming that John is a better man because he married Abigail. Yet again bringing up John's marriage and family and the fact that he chose them over Dutch. Now, obviously, I understand that when this game came out, we did not have the entire context of the second game to support it, so of course, the writers wanted to focus a little more on the dynamic between John and Dutch because it was the first time we were ever hearing or seeing it. But I still find it interesting that Dutch chooses to focus on John and only John here. All of his anger, all of his insults, all of his gripes are only towards John. He does not give any attention to the government agents that are standing in the room as well. Despite his supposed grief with the American government and the Pinkertons, he does not give them an ounce of attention. He wanted to hone in on John, and John specifically, and say things that he knew would deliberately piss that man off. And that's exactly what he did. But with all of that being said, I think it's time to move on to Dutch's final moments and the last speech that he would ever give. Thank God. When we talk about Dutch's final speech before he eliminates himself, I'm so sorry, I hate censoring myself. Most people are aware that this directly parallels the speech that he gives at the end of the mission Favored Sons, which I will say, I think that that's a deliberate detail in and of itself. Harkening back to what we said before about Dutch believing that he's not a good speaker anymore, he's now rehashing old speeches that he's already given. Or, I don't know, maybe he thought it was a banger and he wanted to recite it again because he was getting ready to fall off a cliff for the second time. I don't know. I'm not going to recite the whole speech or bring up every line in it because it's very famous and I'm sure most of you know it. But I want to bring to attention how much he talks about being unable to change and human nature. We've spoken at length about Dutch's tendency to avoid blame by diverting the conversation. And while you could argue that that's what's happening here, he seems like he's finally taking some accountability for the first time in his life. Except he's not. He might acknowledge that he's done some kind of wrong or committed some kind of violence or hurtful acts, but he is deliberately choosing to place the blame on something that is supposedly outside of his control. Instead of admitting that he was the one who made all of the terrible decisions he did, he says it was just his nature and that's something that he just can't change. Saying that this is just how he is and how he was meant to be and it's never going to be any different is an attempt to absolve himself of everything John blames him for. And I don't know if it's ego, I don't know if it's pride, I don't know if it's some secret third thing that just prevents Dutch from being able to admit when he's wrong. But even as John pleads him to just give up and understand that there is no walking away from this, Dutch just says that he simply can't. He is a fighter, and he cannot change that about himself. I have always found Dutch's line about finding a new monster interesting because I never truly understood if he was talking about John or not. Assuming he is, it almost sounds like a warning of sorts. Given that he goes on to say, our time has passed, it feels as though Dutch is trying to say that men like them don't belong here anymore. It feels like he's trying to make one last connection with John. It is also not lost to me that this is a sentiment that Arthur communicated to Dutch throughout the course of the second game. Almost every time the law had caught up with them, Arthur consistently told Dutch that it felt like their time was up. I'm unsure if John ever knew that Arthur felt this way, but it does feel very intentional for Dutch to use a sentiment that he heard Arthur say often and attempt to convince Dutch of right before taking his own life. But this line also just kind of feels like Dutch is attempting to downplay all of the harm that he's caused. He's insinuating that law enforcement just finds new people to target because that's their job. When they take care of him, they'll move on to the next one, and the cycle will just continue. There is no deeper meaning, there is no complexity to who they target. It's just their job, and that is how they operate. And we know that this is a system that Dutch is not fond of, nor does he think that he should be a target of. For being the last thing that he says, it is certainly quite dramatic, and it can be interpreted in a few different ways, and I'm sure that is exactly what Dutch would have wanted. This video ended up much longer than I intended it to be, so I think I'm just gonna kind of wrap up my final thoughts now. To be honest, I could have dissected nearly every piece of dialogue and talked about how Dutch depends far too much on his ego, and he's this master manipulator with the way that he uses language, but that just simply wouldn't be true. Yes, he undoubtedly uses his knowledge of other people's emotions and vulnerabilities to his own benefit, and he is very good at guilt-tripping vulnerable people. But saying that Dutch is evil and always manipulating people just isn't true. Not to play devil's advocate and defend the antagonist, and more importantly, the guy I can't stand, but there are plenty of times that Dutch's bullshit is called out for being exactly that, bullshit. Especially as a player, and even more if you've played this game a few times, it becomes more and more obvious when Dutch is just saying things just to say them, or trying to get a reaction or skew things in his favor. There are just so many things that are so fascinating about Dutch van der Linde. As much as I hate him, he is a very, very fun character to dissect and look at the intricacies of, because there is just so much. Just taking a look at how he uses language tells you so much about him because it's such a big part of who he is. I truly do curse Dutch van der Linde for being so god-awful and yet so fun to analyze at the same time. Okay, well, I spoke for a lot longer than I intended. If you stuck around for this long, I applaud you. Good job. Again, a huge thank you to all of the support and love that I got on my last video. It really does mean a lot to me. It's just been so much more than I can imagine. I know it's not like it went, crazy viral or anything, but again, 6,000 views means a lot to me. I've seen the suggestions I've gotten and I've definitely added them to my backlog of ideas. So if there's anything you want to see me yap about, definitely let me know and I'll make note of it. Or you could always follow my TikTok to get my more sporadic and impulsive rants. Stay safe, take care of yourself, and I will see you when I see you next. Bye-bye!